Imagine waking up one morning to find that the backbone of American industry has simply snapped. This October, something unimaginable happened inside the warehouses of the London Metal Exchange. The United States aluminum reserves, the emergency buffer meant to stabilize the nation's supply chain, didn't just drop, they collapsed to absolute zero. One day, there were 125 tons left. The next day, nothing. Suddenly, the metal framing your windows, shielding your car's engine, and lining your pantry isn't just expensive, it has become a luxury. But this economic earthquake wasn't caused by a war, a shortage, or a natural disaster. It was triggered by one decision, a single number, a 50% tariff aimed at protecting American jobs. What looked like a bold power move turned out to be a demolition charge planted right at the foundation of the U.S. economy. But while Washington was distracted by political scandals and leaked phone calls, something far more dangerous was happening in the background. Canada, America's most critical supplier, didn't beg for mercy. They didn't wait. They simply left. They packed up their metal and rerouted their ships to Europe. This isn't just a story about inflation. It's the story of how when the administration reactivated aluminum tariffs earlier this year, first slapping on a 25% duty in February, then doubling down to a brutal 50% in June, the stated purpose was seductive in its simplicity. The logic went like this: punish foreign producers, make imported metal prohibitively expensive, and force American manufacturers to buy from American smelters. On paper, it looks like a win for domestic industry. It sounds like America first. But there was a fatal flaw in this plan, a gap in logic so massive that it is baffling it wasn't addressed from the start. The United States simply does not produce enough aluminum. Not even close. The U.S. manufacturing sector doesn't just rely on imports, it depends on them for basic survival. And at the very top of that import list sits one country, Canada. Canada supplies more than half of all the primary aluminum the U.S. consumes. This means Canadian aluminum isn't a luxury item you can just swap out for a cheaper generic brand. It is the literal backbone of the system. So when Washington spiked the cost of that essential supply by 50%, the market didn't pivot to American metal because there wasn't enough American metal to pivot to. Instead, something entirely predictable yet devastating happened. Canadian aluminum became instantly unaffordable. American fabricators, can makers, and builders looked at the new price tag, inflated by half overnight, and refused to pay. But they still needed metal to keep their factories running. So where did they turn? They turned inward. They looked at the stockpiles sitting in U.S. warehouses, the nation's strategic commercial reserves, and they started draining them. This wasn't a slow consumption, it was a panic-induced run on the bank. For the first time in modern history, U.S. industry was burning through its emergency buffer faster than it could possibly be replenished. The nation was essentially eating its own safety net to survive the month. The fatal flaw wasn't the tariff itself. It was the arrogant assumption that the American market could withstand it. The policy assumed that if you wall off the border, domestic industry will bloom. Instead, by cutting off the primary bloodline from Canada without having a domestic alternative ready, the U.S. didn't strengthen its position. It starved itself. And as those warehouses began to empty, the countdown to a total supply shock began to tick. By October, as the final tons of metal were being scraped from the bottom of the national reserves, one would expect the alarm bells in Washington to be deafening. One would expect emergency summits in the Commerce Department and frantic meetings in the Oval Office to address the supply chain fracture. But Washington was not focused on the collapse. Instead, the White House was entirely consumed by a different kind of explosion, a diplomatic bombshell that sucked every ounce of oxygen out of the room. As just the economic pressure was peaking, a leaked phone call between Donald Trump's top envoy, Steve Witkoff, and Vladimir Putin's senior foreign policy advisor, Yuri Ushakov, hijacked the news cycle. The leak was sensational, political, and perfectly timed to distract from the earthquake brewing beneath the surface of the real economy. According to details that flooded the press, the U.S. envoy had allegedly coached the Kremlin on how to speak Trump's language, how to frame a peace pitch, and even how Putin should flatter the president. The quote, "We put a 20-point Trump plan together. Maybe we do the same thing with you," ricochetted across newsrooms like shrapnel. Reporters descended on the White House. Cable news panels dissected every syllable. President Trump, instead of managing the unfolding aluminum disaster, was forced to pivot to damage control, insisting he hadn't reviewed the call and dismissing it as routine diplomacy. For weeks, the Capitol was paralyzed by this political firestorm. Advisors scrambled, criticism surged, and the cameras stayed fixed on the diplomatic drama. But while the politicians argued about phone calls and foreign policy etiquette, the real crisis, the one that actually threatened the livelihood of American workers, was being ignored. Washington was distracted by the smoke, failing to notice that the factory floor was already burning down. The aluminum sector was buckling, and the people in charge were too busy fighting a PR war to notice. By the time the last ton of aluminum left the national reserves, the market didn't just react, it detonated. Traders, suppliers, and analysts began describing the American aluminum system as effectively broken. These were not political pundits hyperbolizing for effect. These were the people handling the physical metal, watching the supply chain collapse from the inside. The immediate result was an explosion in the Midwest premium, the built-in surcharge that determines what American buyers must pay just to get their hands on the metal. Even before suppliers added 1 cent of extra profit, the sheer cost of doing business in the United States had already become unbearable. But astonishingly, the most devastating blow didn't come from domestic policy or the tariffs themselves. It came from the suppliers who decided that the United States had simply become too dangerous to serve. While U.S. reserves were collapsing, global suppliers took an unprecedented step that shattered the market. Rio Tinto, one of the largest aluminum producers on Earth, quietly imposed a massive new surcharge on top of the already inflated U.S. Midwest premium. When you combined the 50% tariff, the skyrocketing Midwest premium, and this new supplier fee, the cost was staggering. Together, they added more than $2,600 per ton on top of the underlying metal price. This pushed the total markup above 70%. Overnight, American buyers were forced to pay more than any other aluminum market on the planet. However, it is crucial to understand that this move wasn't born out of corporate greed or exploitation. It was born out of fear. Producers made it crystal clear. Holding and shipping aluminum to the United States had become a financial liability. The implementation of a 50% tariff meant that one sudden policy shift, one midnight tweet, or one rule change could demolish their profits instantly. Uncertainty had become a cost, and that cost was now being passed directly to the American consumer. Jean Simard, head of the Aluminum Association of Canada, put it plainly: the tariffs significantly increased the risk of shipping metal to the U.S. It was no longer a reliable partnership. It was a gamble. Consequently, Canadian producers began choosing safety over chaos. They initiated a massive withdrawal. Exports to the United States dropped sharply. Quebec, the heart of the North American aluminum industry and home to massive smelters like Rio Tinto, Alouette, and Alcoa, saw its shipment ratios plummet. Historically, 95% of their output flowed south to feed American industry. Almost overnight, that number fell to 78%, and the downward trend showed no signs of stopping. This wasn't just a market shift, it was an evacuation. The aluminum that was supposed to build American cars and American homes was being diverted at the source. The supply chain was physically breaking apart, and as the ships stopped turning south, they began charting a new course, one that would leave the United States isolated on the world stage. And where did all that aluminum go? It didn't vanish into thin air. As the doors to the American market slammed shut, the massive cargo ships leaving the ports of Quebec didn't just drop anchor and wait for Washington to change its mind. Instead, shipments that had flowed almost exclusively south for decades began sailing east. Behind this exodus was one critical advantage the U.S. completely overlooked. For years, Canada had quietly built something the U.S. never expected it would actually need to use: a frictionless, tariff-free, modern trade alliance with Europe. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, known as CETA, became Canada's emergency escape hatch the moment the U.S. tariffs returned. While American politicians viewed trade as a zero-sum game of punishment and leverage, Europe offered something the U.S. no longer provided: certainty. Under the protection of CETA, Canadian aluminum, along with minerals, machinery, and fuels, could enter Europe without the political volatility or the shock of midnight tariff hikes that now plagued the American market. The results were instantaneous and staggering. Prior to this crisis, Europe's share of Canadian aluminum exports was virtually a rounding error, a negligible 0.2%. It was statistically irrelevant. But in the wake of the U.S. tariff spike, that number surged to nearly 18%. This wasn't a gradual incline, it was a vertical takeoff. Major producers moved with aggressive speed to lock in these new partners. Alouette, one of the region's key smelters, diverted more than half of its entire output to Europe in a single quarter. Alcoa alone rerouted over 100,000 metric tons of metal away from American factories and toward European docks. This wasn't just a temporary adjustment to balance the books, it was a rewiring of the global trade map. Before the tariffs, Canada's trade strategy was simple: everything goes to the U.S. After the tariffs, Europe became the safe lane, the reliable buyer that didn't treat its partners as economic hostages. The irony of the situation is palpable. The U.S. policy was designed to strengthen domestic industry by cutting off foreign reliance. Instead, it achieved the exact opposite. It forced its closest ally to diversify, effectively pushing Canada into the arms of the European Union. Europe didn't have to steal Canada's trade. America simply pushed it away, and Europe opened the door. This pivot represents more than just aluminum moving from point A to point B. It signifies a realignment of loyalty and logistics. Supply chains are sticky. Once new contracts are signed, new shipping routes are established, and new relationships are forged, they are incredibly difficult to break. By the time Washington wakes up to the reality of the shortage, they may find that the Canadian supply they took for granted has found a new permanent home across the Atlantic. The trade system didn't break, it reorganized itself, leaving the United States on the outside looking in. We are now entering a new economic reality, and the bill is coming due. Bank of America's head of metals research, Michael Widmer, issued a chilling warning that sums up the situation perfectly. It's a new reality now. If the U.S. wants aluminum, it has to pay up. Translation: the United States now must outbid the entire world just to secure the basic materials it needs to build. This has flipped the global playing field upside down. Imagine two car companies competing for the same market. One is in Germany, paying normal global prices for aluminum. The other is in Michigan, forced to pay the highest premiums on Earth. The outcome is mathematically guaranteed. American firms simply cannot compete. But the economic pain is only half the story. The diplomatic fallout is perhaps even more dangerous. Europe, America's closest economic partner, is losing patience. Behind closed doors, European officials are drafting retaliation plans, warning that if the U.S. continues to weaponize tariffs, Europe will have no choice but to unwind parts of its trade cooperation. The irony is impossible to ignore. A tariff designed to punish foreign rivals has instead created a unified block of frustration among America's own allies. Analysts at S&P Global have asked the question nobody in Washington wants to hear. Is this a paradigm shift? Because supply chains are like rivers. Once you divert the flow and carve a new path, The water doesn't just naturally run back uphill to the old channel. The world is changing, trade routes are hardening, and the United States may soon wake up to find that the supply chains it once took for granted are no longer coming home. America didn't lose the aluminum market because it was outcompeted. It lost because it outpriced itself. So, I leave you with this question. Do you think the U.S. can reverse this isolation? Or have we just witnessed the permanent end of American industrial dominance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this analysis valuable, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden mechanics of the global economy. Thanks for watching.